Yes!
Hello and welcome to this week's Davinci Resolved and part 2 of our web shooter tutorial. This week we'll be finishing up our animation in Blender and compositing it in Resolve. Let's get started. Okay, so the first thing I've done is I've decided in my clip where exactly I need my CGI webbing to start. So I've gone to about here and I've seen, okay, at this point the web's come out and the CGI is going to last for the remainder of the video. So I've just marked in and out points, and then I've split the clip as well using control backspace, which will allow you to just cut the clip like that. And that has allowed me to set in and out points. And then when you go to the deliver tab, we now want to export just this section here as TIFF images. So I'm going to press I on the keyboard to set the in point there, and then the out is already set to the end. Now we want to choose a location to export these images to, so we can choose, say, let's just say a location here, and we'll say images, and we'll call them IMG, and save. And then when we go to video, we want to set the format to a TIFF sequence. And then if I clear all these previous renders and add to render queue and click start render, it's then going to export everything within the in-out range as an image sequence. So once your footage has been exported in the TIFF format, we just want to do one more thing. Let's go back to the edit tab, and then where you've got your CG portion, you want to click on that, right click and go to new fusion clip. I've already done this, so I'm not going to do it now, but that will convert this section of footage into a fusion clip. So when we click on fusion, we've got a composition there ready to go. So what we want to do now is go and open up Blender and open up that blend file that we had from part 1, which is where we made our web. Next we want to click this plus arrow up here and go to VFX and motion tracking. If you click on open up here and go to the location where we've just saved our image sequence from Resolve, double click on that. Clear. So here you can see we've got our sequence of images. If you just hit A on the keyboard, it will select everything in the folder and then click open clip, and you'll now see that we have our footage in Blender. And the first thing you want to do is just click on this button here, prefetch, because it will load the frames into your RAM, so you'll get a much faster playback if you're playing back your video footage. Okay, so you'll see here that I'm wearing the web shooters that I 3D printed. Now there's two reasons behind that. One, it looks kind of cool, and two, it gives you a nice area of high contrast to track. So let's go to where we get a nice clear frame of that web shooter. Now I'm going to hold down control on the keyboard and click on that web shooter, and you'll see that it's added a tracker, and this is basically exactly the same as motion tracking in Fusion. It's slightly different because Blender has a few different funny ways of doing things. So if you want to scale this tracker up, you press S on the keyboard. I'm just going to enable my screencast keys actually, just so you can see what I'm doing. Yeah, press S on the keyboard and that will scale that up to around the size you want, and then G to move, G for grab to move. Okay, so once you're happy with the location of your tracker, if you hit Control and then press T on the keyboard, it will track forward. And Blender is ridiculously fast at tracking. So it looks like it's not done anything, but actually it's already tracked the entire thing. And then if you want to track backwards, you hold down Control Shift and then press T, and it will track backwards until it gets to the point where it can no longer see your point of footage. Now say it gets to here and okay, it's lost it. All you have to do is go to the first frame where it can no longer see your tracker, realign it with the G key to grab, and then hit Control Shift and T again to track backwards, and it will keep going. Now it goes off about here, doesn't actually matter because our web is only going to come out at about this frame anyway. So that's pretty much the tracking portion of this done. Next you're going to want to go to Solve and click on Set Background, and that will just set the clip here as the background in your Blender scene. Next you want to click on Geometry and you want to go link empty to track. And that will take this track that we've just done and it will create a 3D point in the world that will track exactly to your footage, as you can see up here. So let's click on Layout tab just to go back to our Blender scene and hit 0 on the keyboard to bring up the camera. I've still got screencast on, that's good. And what we're going to want to do now is go to Tool, View, and go to Lock Camera to View, because now we want to manipulate our web into the rough position of where it would be in 3D space. Just like that. And we've got our cube here, which is quite handy because it allows us to line up the perspective well. So I'm going to zoom roughly until that's at about the right place. There. Now, one problem I came across was that the simulation that I'd baked, I really liked it, but it just wasn't fast enough for the footage that I'd shot. Now, I tried speeding up the simulation by moving the cube faster through our mesh, but that ended up ruining the simulation and I didn't get the same nice effect that I got here. So, the best way to do this is to export the simulation as a lightwave point cache and then re-import it back in to retime it. That sounds a bit complicated, but I'll show you what I mean. First thing you need to do is go to Edit Preferences and search MDD and bring up this Import Export NewTek MDD format, and this will allow you to export your simulation to a point cache. So you can click on your web and just go to File, Export, and then you should see this Lightwave Point Cache option. Click on that and export it to a place that you want. So I'm going to export it here. Then on our web itself, if we go to physics, we can delete our cloth simulation completely. So now nothing's happening at all to our web. But what we can do is add a new modifier, and we're going to add the mesh cache option. And this is going to allow us to import that MDD data back in. So let's choose that file path where we've just saved that data. So there it is. Let's import that back in. And it may change the rotation of your mesh. If that's the case, just rotate it back into the correct position. So in my case, that would be rotating it -90 on the y-axis, just like that. So now we have our animation, but it's no longer a simulation, it's actually a baked point cache. And this is going to mean that we can retime it to match our footage. So now to retime our footage to match our plate here, all we want to do is click on Custom, and this will remove any animation from our mesh cache, but it will allow us to say where we want the mesh cache to be playing on what frame. So I'm going to go to where I want the web to start. So let's say we want the web to come out at maybe frame 14, and I'm going to set the evaluation frame to 1. So what that means is at frame 14 we want it to be playing frame 1 of this simulation, and then I'm going to press with the mouse over this value here, I'm going to press I on the keyboard, and that's going to add a keyframe. And I'm just going to change the view down here to dope sheet because that will allow you to see the keyframes that you set. Let's go to Action Editor there. Okay, so now we can see the keyframe that we've just set for this evaluation frame. Okay, so at what point do we want the web to shoot out and hit the wall? Probably, I'd say, okay, 30 frames a second, half a second, that's 15 frames. So let's say at frame 26. So then we grab this evaluation frame here and we just drag it along, and as you can see it's scrubbing through the frames. So we're saying, okay, at frame 26 we actually want it to be on frame 12, let's say, and it's gone orange because the value's changed, but we haven't set a keyframe. So just press I in that value again, and then it will keyframe that. And so if we now press play, we can see that it's retimed that animation. So we know we're at frame 12 here. We now want the rest of the animation to play out. So let's go to the end of our footage, and we'll say, okay, at this frame we want it to be at frame 140 because that's the end of the animation. Now we're going to hit I to keyframe that, and then hit play. And now we have our animation, but we've retimed it so that it shoots out a lot quicker and with the right timing to our footage, but then plays the rest of the animation at normal speed. Now, one thing we will need to do if we've retimed our animation using the mesh cache option is we're just going to need to re-add our hook modifiers, because they need to be added after the mesh cache in the chain. So I'm just going to add these hook modifiers again. I'll time lapse through that. If you want to know how to do that, just go back and watch part 1, because we went through adding those hook modifiers on quite extensively. So I'll see you in a sec. So I've added the hook modifiers back on, and now we have manual control over our mesh again, moving that around. So what we're going to do is parent this hook empty to the track that we had earlier, and as a result you'll see that this will squash and stretch. It will move around with our tracked empty there. So I'm going to click on the hook that we made, and then I'm going to shift click on the tracked empty from earlier, and I'm going to hit Control P and set the parent to object, and you're going to see that this link here will pop up. Now if we hit play, you'll see that the mesh will actually squash and stretch with the movement of the arm, which is really cool. So with the hook modifiers, we can now also animate the web manually if we want things to look a little more natural. So as the arm pulls away, you'd expect the web to go a little bit more tense. So what we can do is grab these hook modifiers here, and as you can see, we've got individual control over these different parts. So I would say maybe go to just before the arm starts moving, for example, click on our hook there and press I, and then set a keyframe for the location, and then move it to where I'd think, okay, I want it to be stretched out, and then I press G to grab it and move it, and then press I again on location, and now you can see that this hook is animated, and it will actually move parts of the web with it as well. And we can do the same wherever we've added a hook. So maybe as the arm gets pulled again, I would say this bit would stretch a bit more, so I can click on this hook, set a location keyframe, go to where it's stretched, and then just grab it and just subtly, you don't want to do too much because it would look ridiculous, but just subtly move it just to give it a bit more of a natural look. Hit I on the keyboard again, and I'm going to keyframe that, and now you can see where these hooks are moving around, that it's just animating the web in a bit more of a natural way, and that's going to give you a much more realistic look. I'm not going to do the whole thing. I'll leave it to your artistic judgment to decide how you want to animate your hooks. I've also slightly changed the web material. I've added some transparent shaders to it and driven that by a noise texture, which just gives us this kind of like mottled see-through look to certain parts of the web. Again, I'm not going to go through this because it's beyond the scope of this video, and I'm pretty sure there's 100 guys out there that could do a better job than me. But if you want to have a look at this node graph and want to have a go replicating it yourself, there it is. And I'm going to also include the blend file, so you can use this material yourself if you want to. The final thing I did was add a shadow catcher, because we want to capture the natural shadows from the lighting in our scene and match it to the back wall of our footage. So I've just created a basic plane, and I also created a shadow catcher material because I'm rendering this in Eevee, which is a real-time render engine, which doesn't have support for shadow catchers quite like Cycles does, which is I suppose you could say Blender's premium render engine. So I've created this shadow catcher material, which kind of cheats the shadow catcher look. And again, you can have a look at the graph here if you want to try and replicate it yourself, and it will be in the blend file along with everything else. So now our shadow catcher is working. You can see that the shadows are just naturally appearing in our scene over our footage there, which looks great. To save ourselves a job of masking out the web in Fusion, I've just created a cube which I've animated to travel along the length of the web as it's shooting out the hand. And then I've added the holdout shader to it, just like in last video, so that when we go into rendered view, everything that is contained within or behind the cube will not be rendered at all. And as a result, it's going to save us some work later on. And with that, we are ready to render. So when we're ready to render, click on the Output tab and just choose a location you want to save your image sequence to. Make sure it's saved as PNG and set to RGBA, so you've got the transparency value there as well. If you hit F12 on the keyboard, it will do a render of the current frame, and you'll get an idea of what that's going to look like. We want to render the whole animation though, so make sure you've got your start and end frame set and click render and then render animation, and that will go through each image in the sequence and will render out a PNG image sequence of your entire web. So once you've got that finished, you should have in your folder something that looks a bit like this. And now we are finally ready to get compositing in Davinci Resolve. So now back in Davinci Resolve, if we go into that Fusion composition we created earlier, we can import our web footage we exported from Blender and just drag that in. Now if we drag that over our background footage and display that and we press play, we should see that our footage pretty much perfectly matches with what we rendered out of Blender. Now there's a few things we can do to make this look a little more realistic. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on the merge node and change the apply mode to luminosity, and that will just bleed through some of the light from the background plate footage, and that already looks a lot better. Now you'll also see that the plate that we rendered from Blender is a lot more in focus than the rest of the shot, so I'm going to add a blur node and just blur that by maybe 0.3 of a pixel, 0.4, yeah, just to make that blend a bit better. And then I'm also going to add a grain node, which will add just a bit of grain to our footage as well, which will match it in with our background plate. Finally, we want to add some motion blur when the web comes out the hand. So normally, if you're rendering from cycles, you can export something known as a vector pass, which has all the movement information, and then we could feed that into a blur node in Fusion and it would do all the blurring for us. But Eevee doesn't have that pass available at the moment. So what we're going to have to do is find a point where the web starts to come out of our hand, so which is about there, and then I'm going to add a directional blur node. To our web as well, and I'm going to set the angle to match the angle that the web is coming out the hand and turn up the strength, say roughly that angle, and then I'm going to set a keyframe, and then we're going to go through to where the web stops moving, where it hits the wall about there. So I'm going to put a keyframe here, and then a couple frames later we want the blur to be set to 0. And now if we play that through like this, we just get a more realistic motion blur added to our web. So the final stage is just to mask out our web where it hits the web shooter, because currently it's sitting over our web shooter. And secondly, we want to just get rid of some shadow at the beginning here, because we don't want this shadow catcher to be displayed at the beginning. We only want it to be displayed once our web has fired. So we're going to mask these out. So the first thing we're going to do is the web shooter, and we're going to use the tracker to help us. So I'm going to click on the background footage and I'm going to add a tracker node, and I'm going to drag that over our web shooter just like we did in Blender. Let's just get that there, and then I'm going to hit track forward from current time, and that will just track through our web shooter. Okay, and then we can track backwards as well. I'm just going to change the search area, because the larger the search area, the longer your track's going to take. So let's just track backwards from current time. Okay, and again, we don't need it to be perfect all the way through, because we know that we're only going to start tracking properly from when the web comes out. So next I'm going to draw a shape around our web shooter using the polygon tool, and just drawing out a rough basic mask around that like that, and then I'm going to feed that into our merge node, and then I'm going to invert it. So now everything but what's behind this mask will be shown. Now if we click on our polygon and we right click center, we can connect it to that tracker that we just made in tracker 1 there. So let's right click center, connect to tracker 1 position. And now if we see our mask here, it will follow along the position. Now it's going to move the base position of the mask, so I'm just going to drag it along so it lines up again correctly. With our footage, and now when we scrub through, we should see that it tracks our mask nicely to our hand. You may have to go in and neaten up just where it's gone off slightly, so you can click on your polygon and just drag these points around and keyframe them just to fit in, but the tracker should do most of the heavy lifting for you. Finally, we just want to get rid of this bit of shadow here that's causing us some issues, so I'm going to add another polygon shape to that. I'm just going to draw a very rough mask around that shadow capture area where we don't want it to show. Just like that, and I'm going to, holding down shift, I'm going to add it into the chain there, and I'm going to set the paint mode to subtract, and so it's going to subtract from our mask, and then we can just animate this shape to get rid of it as the web comes in. So just like that. In fact, at this point we probably can get rid of the entire thing. Yeah, there we go. So if we scrub through, you'll just see that now it just gets rid of that nasty bit of shadow at the beginning. May have missed a spot here, so I'm just going to go in there and tighten that up. Adding another spline there. And there we go, that's all there is to it. So after putting everything together, including a overlay for the camera and some Foley and room tone, the final result looks a bit like this. Yes! Thanks for watching this two-part series. I hope it made sense and you learned something. If you have any questions, I'll try my best to answer them in the comments. Next time, I'm planning on doing a teleportation effect, similar to number 5 from the Umbrella Academy, all in Davinci Resolve. If you want to see that, hit subscribe and the bell icon, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.